In 1911, the American government dismantled the largest monopoly in history. Rockefeller lost everything. Except one thing, he became 3 times richer. How can a man profit from his own destruction? Because he didn't build a company, he built a system. Subscribe right now and write in the comments. Which of today's corporations do you think is the new Rockefeller? Amazon, Google, Pfizer, write what you think. I read every comment. And now to business. Everything you're about to hear is documented. The US government's antitrust investigation, 800 pages of sworn testimony, materials from the Library of Congress, archival documents from the Rockefeller Research Center in Pocantico Hills. The Supreme Court decision dated May 15, 1911. You can verify every one of these sources yourself. Let that sit for a second. By the end of this video, you'll understand 3 things. First, how one person single-handedly rebuilt the architecture of an entire economy. Second, why a state that tries to break a system like this most often only strengthens it. Third, why the structure Rockefeller built in the 1800s surrounds you right now, not in a textbook. Today, this is not a villain story. A villain story is a boring story. The villain makes mistakes. The villain gets caught. The villain gets punished. The end. This is a story about a mechanism. A mechanism doesn't make mistakes. A mechanism doesn't get caught. A mechanism adapts. And this particular mechanism worked for 150 years, and it's still working while you're watching this video. A better question to ask yourself isn't how do I escape the system, it's how does the system around me work? Because only understanding the mechanism gives you real choice. Not the illusion of choice. 1839, rural New York State, a small town called Richford. Along the dusty roads of the Midwest, a man travels with a wagon. His name is William Avery Rockefeller. He called himself Bill Rockefeller, botanist and herbalist. He peddles medicine. The label says, a radical cure for cancer. Price $2.50. In today's money, about $70. He didn't turn away from the dying. He looked for them, because a dying person will pay any price for hope. William looked people in the eyes, people who knew they didn't have long left, took the money, sat back on the wagon, and rode to the next town. He was never afraid of being exposed. By the time the truth managed to reach the next town, he was already gone. Later, biographers would record something strange. William Rockefeller lived a double life. In one town, Bill, botanist and medicine man. In another, William Rockefeller, a respected citizen. For many years, he maintained 2 families in different states. He was a con man, but he was also a teacher, the best teacher his son ever had. Little John watched his father from childhood, and he learned the lesson not cruelty. Cruelty is inefficient. He learned something more important. Information asymmetry is capital. If you know what the counterparty doesn't know, the transaction is always in your favor. The product doesn't have to be the best. It has to occupy the space before a competitor does. From childhood, Rockefeller kept records of every penny. He wrote every transaction in a small notebook. How much earned, how much spent, how much donated to church. He kept that habit his entire life. He didn't trust intuition. He trusted a system. In 1870, 30-year-old John Davison Rockefeller, together with partners, founded Standard Oil Company of Ohio. Capitalization $1 million. 2 large refineries in Cleveland. About 10% of all U.S. refining. 10%. Around him, chaos. In the late 1860s, the oil industry went through a crisis of overproduction. There were too many oil companies, prices were falling. Most refiners were operating at a loss. Competitors cut prices to survive, and by doing so, they accelerated their own bankruptcy. Rockefeller saw it differently. He didn't see a crisis, he saw an opportunity. A market that's panic liquidating is a market you can acquire. Cheap. 10 years later, 90. Think about that. From 10 to 90% of an entire industry in 1 decade. Not through inventing a new product, not through a technological revolution, through a system. February 1872, Cleveland, Ohio. The city has 26 independent refineries. By the end of March that same year, only 4 will remain. Here's how it happened. Imagine a man comes to you, calm, polite, no threats. He offers to purchase your refinery. You name a price. He agrees to negotiate. You think you're dealing with an ordinary business deal. Then he explains one detail. The railroad that carries your oil to market has already made a deal with him. Not with you, with him. You pay the standard rate per barrel. He pays half. Plus, the railroad pays him back a percentage of every payment you make. That was called a rebate. The scheme was called the South Improvement Company. Laws against this didn't exist yet in 1872. Every day you keep operating, you take a loss. Every day he operates, he makes a profit, plus part of your expenses. There is only one alternative, except Rockefeller always paid a fair price. That's important to understand. He didn't steal refineries. He bought them at market value, but the market value had already been artificially lowered by his own rebate scheme. Owners lost money every day. They sold because the alternative was bankruptcy. Rockefeller gave them a choice. It's just that both choices ended the same way. One refinery owner in Cleveland tried to hold out. 6 weeks later, he was bankrupt. 22 of Cleveland's 26 refineries were absorbed by Rockefeller in 2 months. That's not competition, that's surgery. Fast, precise, technically legal. Think about that. The modern journalist Ida Tarbell, one of the first to document these events in her long investigative work published in 1904, called it the Cleveland Massacre. The name stuck, because you can't come up with anything more accurate. Today, Amazon enters a new product category. First, it opens it to third-party merchants. It studies the data, what moves at what price with what margin. Then it launches its own version under the Amazon Basics brand at a lower price. The merchant who gave Amazon the data funds their own displacement. Different eras, same mechanics. 1875, Rockefeller looks at a line item in an expense report. Wooden barrels for transporting oil, each one 25 cents. His competitors pay the same. All of them depend on the same supplier. Put that in perspective. A year later, Standard Oil has its own sawmill, its own barrel production. Cost 15 cents. The difference 40% on every barrel. Do the math. At the volumes Standard Oil was moving, that was millions of dollars a year staying inside the system instead of going to a supplier. Money that used to flow outward now stayed inside, then its own pipelines. Rockefeller understood pipelines solve two problems at once. First, reduce dependence on railroads and their variable rates. Second, creating a new barrier for competitors who can't afford their own pipeline network. When he controlled the pipelines, a competitor could produce oil but couldn't transport it except through his system. And for that, they paid him. Then its own tanker fleet on the Great Lakes. Then its own rail tank cars, he leased them to the railroads, creating yet another income stream. Then a network of distribution terminals across the country. Its own laboratories for processing oil waste, turning it into lubricants, petroleum jelly, and other byproducts, and distributing them separately. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 90% of American refining and most of the pipeline network. This is called vertical integration, control of the entire chain from raw material to the consumer. Rockefeller didn't invent the word. He invented the practice at a scale no one had seen before. Here's the key. Every level of integration lowered his costs and at the same time raised competitors' costs. Barrels are cheaper for him, competitors pay more. Pipelines are his competitors pay him for transport. Terminals are his competitors pay for storage. Every additional level of control became an additional source of income from a market that still formally existed. Today, that's Amazon. Its own warehouses, its own logistics, its own cloud AWS on which half the internet runs, its own delivery system, its own film studio, its own Whole Foods stores. One brain, one will, every level of the chain inside one perimeter. Rockefeller did it 150 years earlier. If you're watching this video and thinking these things only happened in the past, keep watching. The most interesting part is ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. Every week we break down the mechanisms that move money and power in the real world. Only documented facts. Hit the bell, it takes 3 seconds. January 2nd, 1882, New York. 41 investors sign a document that will go down in the history of corporate law. The Standard Oil Trust. Up to that point, Rockefeller had a problem. His companies operated in different states. Each state had its own laws. Coordinating them from a single center was legally difficult. Corporate lawyer Samuel Dodd solved this problem elegantly. 40 companies transfer their shares into a single pool managed by 9 trustees. In exchange, shareholders receive trust certificates. They participate in the profits of the entire system. Formally, each company remains independent. Formally, each has its own board of directors, its own charter, its own state registration. In practice, one board of trustees makes all key decisions for all 40 companies at once. A single pricing policy, a single strategy toward competitors, a single approach to negotiations with railroads and suppliers. None of the companies is legally a monopoly. All of them compete, formally. This was the first corporate structure of its kind in the history of American business. The state didn't know how to deal with it. There were no laws for it. The Sherman Antitrust Act was passed only in 1898 years, after the trust was already operating at full capacity. When the law was finally passed, Standard Oil's lawyers studied it and found a workaround. Instead of a trust, a holding company. Instead of trust certificates, shares of a parent company that owns all the subsidiaries. Same structure, different legal packaging. Read that again. The structure existed for 8 years while the state invented tools to fight it. When the tools appeared, it adapted, not because Rockefeller was a criminal, but because a structure that proves effective will always find a legal form to exist. Today, that's Alphabet. Google is search and advertising. YouTube is video. Waymo is autonomous vehicles. DeepMind is artificial intelligence. Verily is medical technology. Formally, different companies. In practice, a unified strategy under one board of directors. Same structure, different name. Meta owns Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook. Berkshire Hathaway owns more than 50 companies in different industries. The structure of a company that owns companies is Rockefeller's invention. He built it in 1882. The corporate world still uses it. That's not a coincidence. That's architecture the corporate world copied from Rockefeller because it works. May 15, 1911, Washington, D.C. The Supreme Court of the United States issues its decision. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey is found to be an illegal monopoly under the Sherman Act. Forced breakup into 34 independent companies. That day, John Davison Rockefeller was on a golf course in Pocantico Hills. They brought him a note. He read it, put it in his pocket, and kept playing. He wasn't afraid of the court. He knew what the judges didn't know. Here is what Rockefeller knew. Standard Oil was deliberately undervalued in the books. Antitrust pressure in recent years had kept the shares artificially low. Legal uncertainty had weighed on value for years. At the moment of the breakup, his personal fortune was about $300 million, roughly a quarter of the entire company. After the decision, the following happened. Every Standard Oil shareholder received a proportional stake in all 34 new companies. The market now valued each of them separately without antitrust pressure, without legal uncertainty, and with the real assets that had been hidden for years in consolidated reports taken into account. What became clear quickly, Standard Oil had been deliberately kept conserved in accounting terms. The real assets were significantly larger than what the official reports reflected. The shares went up, all 34, at the same time. By 1913, the total value of his holdings reached $900 million. Over the next 10 years, the combined value of the assets of all 34 companies increased fivefold. This is a documented historical fact. The government spent 5 years on the investigation and 3 years on the court case. His fortune tripled. A monopoly can be broken. A system cannot. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. These are 3 of the largest oil corporations in the world today. In 1999, Exxon and Mobil merged back into one company, ExxonMobil. The monopoly that was broken by a government decision in 1911, the market put back together 88 years later. On its own, without coercion, because the economic logic that created the monopoly never went away. Put differently, in 1984, the U.S. Department of Justice broke up the telephone monopoly AT&T into 7 companies, what were later nicknamed Baby Bells. Within 20 years, most of them merged again. In 2005, SBC Communications acquired AT&T itself and took its name. In 2015, AT&T acquired DirecTV. In 2018, Time Warner, a monopoly reassembles itself. Always. This isn't business growth. This is Rockefeller, 1902. Rockefeller creates the General Education Board, the first private foundation in the United States with national reach in education. Initial contribution, $1 million. Over his lifetime, Rockefeller would donate more than $180 million to the board. In the scale of the early 20th century, that was an amount that could change a system. And it did. The board's charter, adopted by Congress in January 1903, declared the advancement of education without distinction of race, sex, or creed. It sounds like pure philanthropy. But here's what documents from the same period say. Frederick Taylor Gates, Rockefeller's chief philanthropic advisor. Director of the board described the board's philosophy in his book, The Country School of Tomorrow, published in 1916. A verified archival document, available in the Library of Congress. I quote, "We shall not try to make these people or their children into philosophers, men of learning or of science. We shall not search for great artists, painters, musicians, or poets among them. We shall not raise up among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. The task we set before ourselves is a very simple one, to train these people as we find them to a perfect life just where they are." In the same document, there is a phrase later quoted by the National Education Association in its address to Congress in 1914. They expressed alarm at the activity of the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundation's agencies, not responsible to the people in their efforts to control the policies of educational institutions. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a documented position of the people who ran the largest private education foundation in the country and the reaction of the professional community that saw it and said it out loud. Read that again. The man who built a system controlling 90% of the country's oil economy financed the education system. What educational model he wanted to reproduce through it, you decide for yourself. Today, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the largest private charitable foundation in the world, funds medical research, education reforms, and sets priorities for global health. Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies pay what regulators call user fees to the Food and Drug Administration, the agency that regulates them. Private money participates in shaping what are called official standards. This is not an accusation. This is mechanics. Exactly the mechanics Rockefeller mastered as a child watching his father's wagon of medicine. Now look at what he built from today's perspective. Rockefeller didn't run the market through price. He ran it through infrastructure. While competitors thought about how to lower the price of oil, he built the pipelines the oil moved through, the terminals where it was stored, the railroad contracts that carried it. When you control infrastructure, you don't need to control the product. The product goes through your system anyway. This is what today is called the platform economy. Amazon is not an online store. It is infrastructure through which commerce flows. Google is not a search engine. It is infrastructure through which information flows. Visa and MasterCard are not banks. They are infrastructure through which payments flow. The owner of infrastructure earns in any scenario whether the market grows or falls, whether products change or not. When the state tried to break Standard Oil, it broke a monopoly on one product. But the 34 fragments kept using the same infrastructure, the same pipelines, the same terminals. The product monopoly disappeared. Control over the infrastructure remained. That was Rockefeller's second lesson. When a system is embedded deeply enough in an economy, it cannot simply be switched off, even by a government decision, because switching off the system means destroying the economy that depends on it. And no one wants to destroy the economy. When regulators today consider cases against Google or Amazon, they study the same thing judges studied in 1911. How to break up a company that has become infrastructure. The answer in 1911 was this: you can break it up. The system will survive the breakup. And by the way, look at what happens to the stock of Google or Meta every time a new antitrust investigation starts. Short-term volatility, long-term growth. Rockefeller knew this back in 1911. This isn't a soft observation. It's a precise historical pattern with documented data. And now, where are you in this system? Imagine the morning of a normal workday. You wake up, check your phone maybe through Google. Order coffee through a delivery service that runs on Amazon's infrastructure or a similar platform. Drive to work maybe after filling your car at a station that traces back to one of Standard Oil's descendants. Exxon, Chevron, BP. Pay with a card through a network that takes a fee from every transaction no matter what happens in the economy. This isn't paranoia. This isn't conspiracy. It's simply a structure you can trace through open data. Think about it differently. Every time you use a service from a major platform, you generate data. Data about what you search, what you acquire, where you go, who you communicate with. This data is the new oil of the 21st century. That's exactly what analysts call it. And just as Rockefeller built infrastructure to control physical oil, today's companies build infrastructure to control information flows. AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, these are the pipelines of our time. A large share of the data generated by the global economy flows through them. Rockefeller didn't invent greed, and he didn't invent monopoly. He invented an architecture that reproduces itself under any system, under any government, under any technological era. Because the logic underneath it is economic, not political. His fortune at the time of his death in 1937, according to historians, was around 1 to 2% of U.S. GDP at the time. For comparison, Bill Gates' fortune in 2018 was about 0.45% of GDP. Rockefeller was richer relative to the size of the economy by roughly 3 to 4 times. This isn't just a big fortune. It's a measure of how deeply the system he built was embedded in the economic life of the country. I am not a financial advisor, but here's what 150 years of documented history shows. First, infrastructure matters more than product. When Rockefeller built his oil empire, oil was the product. Pipelines, terminals, railroad contracts were the infrastructure. Products change. Oil was displaced by gas. Gas is being displaced by renewables. Infrastructure survives any product cycle. When you analyze any major business, ask yourself, does this business offer a product or does it control infrastructure? The answer will tell you more than any financial report. This is not investment advice. It's a historical pattern you can verify yourself. Second, regulatory pressure is not always risk. The antitrust investigation against Standard Oil lasted from 1906 to 1911. 5 years of pressure kept the shares below real value. After the decision, the shares of all 34 companies rose. The combined value of assets rose 5-fold over the next 10 years. This is a documented historical fact. The same pattern was observed during the investigations against Microsoft in the late 90s. Regulatory pressure creates a discount for companies with real infrastructure value. Today, several of the largest technology companies are under antitrust pressure. How these investigations will end is unknown, but the historical pattern exists. Third, understanding structure matters more than understanding the event. When the news reports a merger of major corporations, an antitrust investigation, regulatory changes, most people react to the event. Rockefeller always reacted to the structure. How will control over infrastructure change? Who will gain access to which flow of data or resources? Seeing structure behind the event is a skill. It can be learned. It takes time and the right sources of information. This is a channel that breaks down structure, not the event. That's what makes it different. A like under this video helps the algorithm show it to people who need to know this. Share it with someone who thinks antitrust law solves the problem of monopolies. I'm curious what they'll say. Rockefeller spent his life building a system that would outlive him. It did, but here's what he didn't account for. Every time you understand how a mechanism works, you stop being part of it, not because you escaped, not because you destroyed it, because you see it, and a mechanism that is seen is no longer all-powerful. It's just a mechanism. Rockefeller died in 1937 at the age of 97, the richest man in history relative to his country's GDP. Over his life, he gave more than $500 million to charity. He founded the University of Chicago, Rockefeller University, funded medicine, education, agriculture. That's also part of the system. A few years before he died, he gave an interview. He was asked what he regretted. He answered that he regretted only one thing, that he didn't start earlier. The system outlived him. And it continues to work. Alphabet, Amazon, the oil majors, private foundations influencing standards in education and medicine, these are not an imitation of Rockefeller. They are his direct descendants logically, structurally, architecturally. But here's what has changed. Before, this architecture was invisible to most people. Understanding it required access to archives, legal documents, financial reports kept in closed libraries. Now no, because we have data, open archives, documented historical research, and channels like this that show how it works. A mechanism that is seen is no longer all-powerful. It's just a mechanism, and now you have a tool to see it. If this video gave you a new angle, subscribe to the channel. That's exactly why it exists. Every week, a breakdown of the mechanisms that really move the economy and power. No conspiracy, no politics, only documented facts and structural analysis.